All right, evening folks. I'm Tad Baker. I'm a professor of history at Salem State. And I'm honored to give the annual June 10th Bridget Bishop lecture in honor of the first victim of the 1692 witch hunt. I'm talking today on something a talk I've never really given before. This is really a work in progress. And as I say, you're really not missing much by not seeing the PowerPoint. We tried to get to work because it really is not that photogenic presentations. But I actually entitled it, this is really a work in progress on some of the aspects of my new book, which is a sequel to my book, A Storm of Witchcraft, The Salem Witch Trials and the American Experience. And so I don't know, I'm playing with titles right now. This might be The Wake of the Storm or something like that, I don't know. Maybe something less corny, but the subtitle is the important part, which is really working around the themes of loss, healing, and the legacy of the witch trials. Really looking at Salem and its legacy from like 1693 to somewhat present, maybe at least up to 2017 or so. And essentially what, I guess, in the book I'm sort of trying to do is to, in large part, answer the question of how did people try to heal from the witch hunt here in 1692? And what steps did they take to try to make sure that it wouldn't happen again? We're really doing it, sort of expanding themes from the last two chapters of Storm of Witchcraft and Flooding. And those of you, if you're familiar with the book, I really talk about the history of the witch trials in Salem from its founding as the European settlements, founding of Salem, if you will, on to the present day, right? And then try to place the witch trials that year and a half or so in its context of the bigger picture of Salem history. Because I think that's one of the problems with a lot of the books on Salem. And there are a lot of really good ones out there. They all do different things, but you can't just focus on Salem Village, and you can't just focus on 1692. You really get what's going on. So in Storm of Witchcraft, I really maybe took that to a bit of an extreme, where the last two chapters of the book take place really entirely even after 1693, right? So in some degrees, I'm going to be expanding on some of the themes there. Honestly, the book, Storm of Witchcraft, was about 20,000 words longer than it probably was supposed to be. At least that's what the contract said with the publisher. But you get carried away to this topic. In some degrees, but there were so many things I wanted to do that I couldn't do, particularly with the aftermath. So this kind of gives me a chance to do that. So some of the themes of Storm of Witchcraft of those later chapters, particularly one was like the story of the Salem diaspora, where post 1692 you have people of all different stripes, accusers, victims, others leaving the community for lots of different reasons. In some cases there were clearly economic reasons at play, but also too there are some that clearly just left because of the witch trials. And so I'm going to, it's funny because I'm going to explore that theme more in this book, but let's put it this way, at the time, when I looked at the book and when I was writing the book, I was looking at the suffering, how it extended to people and families well into the 18th century. And at the time, I had never heard the term transgenerational trauma, right? Which I think we're beginning to recognize much more today, is that the trauma that a parent or grandparent suffers can affect people generations out. And I was seeing this as I was researching the book and seeing the people who were hurting, and people saying 40, 50 years later that these families of the victims are still hurting, right? So I'm going to sort of be looking at the Salem diaspora and the descendants and how people are really trying to recover and heal from this process, and looking at this whole sort of process of transgenerational trauma. And also kind of a related theme to that is really efforts at restorative justice. And again, there's a term that probably really wasn't around like 10, 15 years ago when I started working on the book, but it's something that, again, we recognize today. And it's something that was very ongoing during the witch trials or in its immediate aftermath here in Salem, where we know that there were efforts by the victims, by their surviving family members. As late as 1749, the last petition was made to the general court. They were regularly every year or two throughout the 1720s, 30s, and 40s, trying to get, at the very least, a pardon, or what they would refer to a restoration of innocency, if not a formal legal reversal of attainder, which basically removes the charge and the conviction. And that's the thing is, like, we realize today is this has been an ongoing process now since like 1692 or 93, right? And with the most recently, with the I want to sort of bring things up to date in the book. More recently to the pardon for Elizabeth Johnson Jr. a couple of years ago, and the efforts now underway. Recently, there was an act passed by the Connecticut legislature, sort of an apology for all the victims, and there's a similar effort that's ongoing in the Massachusetts legislature that I'm trying to help out with a bit too. So I wanted to talk some about that, and also to talk about the memorialization efforts. And again, I talk about, you know, when I was writing Storm of Witchcraft, we were in the middle. We had already confirmed to ourselves the Gallows Hill team, as we call ourselves, Ben Ray, Marilyn Roach, Peter Savlock, Tom Phillips, Elizabeth Peterson, and I. We knew that Proctor's Ledge was the site of the execution. It was not the right time for me to announce that in the book. Would have sold a lot of copies, but that was not the point of why we were doing that work. And it had to take place when it took place. So actually, if you see the paperback copy of Storm of Witchcraft, my editor at Oxford, when he saw the story on Proctor's Ledge appear, I think on page 2 of USA Today, I said, hey, good news, the paperback's coming out soon, and you can write a new ending that includes Proctor's Ledge. And of course, he said, oh, by the way, we can't change the pages, so you really only have like 2 paragraphs, but it's there. But the point is, I want to talk more about these efforts of memorialization of Salem and other witch hunts. And particularly, too, to really, there's going to be a full chapter in there on the effort to confirm the execution site of Proctor's Ledge, which is never really, the full story has never really been told. There's a good short piece by Marilyn Roach in American Ancestors a few years back that you can get a hold of, but I really want to tell that story in detail as well. So what I want to talk tonight about are kind of a couple of pieces of the story. And again, I'm still working on even how the book is going to be organized, okay, folks? And I'm working on the book proposal. So this is a kind of a work in progress, and I've written sections of it, but haven't necessarily put all the pieces together. But one of the things that I'm working on, this is particularly actually is part of work that Ben Ray, Marilyn Roach, and I, and Tom Phillips are kind of working on, is a kind of the aftermath of Salem. We're working on a couple of documentary projects on that. And actually, it's being pitched to Netflix this week. So. It's never happened. But it's really weird when they start saying, like, and what A-list actor would you like? An actress would like, yeah. Anyhow, but what we're in the project that I was really working on before that we started working on this was the immediate aftermath in Salem Village. I think to me one of the most fascinating things, and frankly I said for years, someone said, what should someone write on Salem? Hasn't it all been? I said, no, we need to look at Salem Village after 1692. And again, like basically when it got to the point when no one took me up on it, I said, okay, I'm just going to do it. So what because it's just fascinating, and I sort of hinted this in Storm of Witchcraft, but I said when you think about particularly what Sundays used to be the most joyous day for any good Puritan, that day of rest, you're dedicating it to the Lord, your community comes together, all crowded together into the small meeting house for like an 8 or 9 hours, right? And think of how that felt when you're now sitting on the same bench with the family that helped what you feel is murder a loved one, or have them suffer in jail for over a year under horrible conditions. Think of how you dreaded now attending worship with your community, that your community is broken, and you have Samuel Parris there, guy who had no pastoral skills in that sense of the word at all, right? Who could never let a good controversy escape him, unfortunately. Poor fellow. He's still in Salem until the summer of 1697 when they finally work out a deal to get him to leave. And then what happens after that? How does Salem try to heal? So a chapter of the book really talks about this process in Salem Village, and it focuses on a couple of people. In Storm of Witchcraft, I talk a lot about Thomas Mall and Samuel Sewell, who I see as two of the heroes of the whole witch trials, if there is anybody a hero. But in this case, I want to focus on. I've been focusing on a couple of the people in particular. I'm looking at Joseph Green. If you're not familiar with Joseph Green, he first appears in the epilogue of Boyer and Nissenbaum's Salem Possessed in 1974. And he's a really remarkable guy. He graduates from Harvard in 1695. He's a poor kid. He's like the eighth son of a large family, a Cambridge tailor, so a really poor family, but somehow but with some help from the community and his late brother's friends, who actually, late brother had been a minister, gone to Harvard. He gets to Harvard and graduates in 1695, and 2 years later he preaches in early November 1697. He preaches his first sermon in Salem Village on a trial, and within 2 or 3 weeks of that, they offer him a contract as the new minister. So you've got this kid who has just turned 23, who is now the new minister of Salem Village, the job that basically 4 ministers have failed at over 25 years. And basically, who in their right minds would take this job, right? But he is a natural. He really is a pastor attending his flock, and he has this amazing healing touch and an ability to bring people together. And I am in awe of this fellow. And fortunately, the good news is he left an amazing record. Of course, we have the Salem Village record book, the sort of the church records for that time. But we also have Green's diary. And we also have his commonplace book, essentially his like notebook, right? Of his thoughts while he's minister of Salem. Unfortunately, he dies far too young. He dies in 1715. I think he's, like 43 at the time. But he keeps a diary pretty much the whole time he's in Salem, and even before. So we have a really good record of, and some of you's like, you kind of wish you had that for Samuel Parris. I guess I'm just as glad we maybe don't. But it'll tell us a lot. So we have a lot of good things to learn about Green, and a lot of good details on what life was like in Salem Village with him, and his efforts to heal the community. And they start almost immediately. He's ordained in 1698 with a formal ordination ceremony in the village, overseen by Reverend John Hale of Beverly. And within 3 weeks of his ordination, he makes his first step to try to heal the community. He convinces the Salem Village Church to accept back into fellowship 3 of Reverend Parris's arch opponents, who would basically wash their hands of the church. But they wanted to come back in, and he quickly convinces the congregation, particularly the church, to do that. So Samuel Nurse, who of course is Rebecca Nurse's son and leader of the Nurse family. At this point, his father has passed away. His brother-in-law, Samuel Tarbox, and Thomas Wilkins. And so that's like a first step in trying to heal. And he takes it on like almost immediately, right? He does other things too, though, important things. He gets the church to accept the halfway covenant, which had been a real point of controversy in Salem Village and elsewhere. Many people, old school, sort of saw this as a loosening of the rules, but it really was time for change, and Salem Village was one of the last places to accept it. And it was a great way to grow church membership and be a sort of really kind of more tolerant, open community, right? He also works to get a new meeting house built that they start construction on in 1701, something that Parris and other ministers had railed at, that it was falling in. And in addition to that, he organizes the first school in Salem Village and contributes to the campaign, really leads the campaign to get a school built. And again, this is a poor fellow with a pretty meager salary of 60 pounds, but he's very charitable and gives to these causes and really leads the way and helps bring the community together over building a new meeting house. And that, let's think about this, it's almost like a symbolic restart, right? Let's just hit reset and try again. Let's get all the bad thoughts out of this old meeting house. We're going to start new. We're going to change the location, right? And of course, it's where the first church in Danvers is today, which was up the street, down the street from where the first meeting house was located. He then works on more serious things. He tries several times to have the church reverse Martha Corey's excommunication. First couple times don't work, and he backs off on this. It ends up, it takes him 5 years. But in the end, the church does reverse her excommunication, much as First Church here would reverse the excommunication of Rebecca Nurse. he has some ingenious ways to bring people together. Early on, when they have the new meeting house, that's an opportunity to reseat the meeting house. Now, folks, reseating the meeting house is really a big controversial undertaking because people in the meeting house are set, men on one side, women on the other, basically by their status and their wealth. The closer to the pulpit, the higher up your social ranking, and basically in the balcony is where you have, the servants and the kids and the enslaved folk. So it's an opportunity to shuffle things up, but also it's a question of whose feathers are going to be ruffled over again. Basically, if you've ever gone through the process of arranging like the wedding reception dinner, oh no, we can't sit, oh no, they don't, right? Yeah, exactly. That's what they're going through like that, right? But Joseph Green does it, and what does he do? He puts Samuel Nurse on the same, and his family, but the same bench with the Putnams, with Ann Putnam and her siblings, Thomas and the parents. Again, to me, this is classic, right? I mean, not to editorialize, I'll try to get out of modern politics, but I think we have a huge problem in America today. I think we all recognize to some degrees that we're all stuck in our bubbles, right? And also too, we tend to sort of, no matter what that bubble is, we tend to assume the worst about people who think differently than we do, or vote differently than we do, which we tend to sort of like, but then not associate with them, and then we demonize, and no, it's got to stop. We need to work together. And that's exactly what Joseph Green realized and said, hey, you know what? They'll sort it out. They'll realize that they're good people. They're all good people, and they have a lot more in common than their differences. And that clearly pays off. Because within a few years, Joseph Green is engineering Ann Putnam's apology and Ann Putnam's membership in the Salem Village Church with the active help and support and approval of Samuel Nurse. So let me back up now, because the other person I really want to talk about is Ann Putnam. This is the process that I call rehabilitating Ann Putnam Jr. Essentially, let's not pay too close attention to what that 11 and 12-year-old girl did, or how it happened, to what degree there was any sorts of mental illnesses or what was going on. Let's try to judge her a little bit more as an adult, because I think she becomes a fairly impressive adult. She is the oldest of 10 children, and her parents, even before the witch trials, faced financial difficulties. In 1697, they have to sell the family home. They build another house on another part of the farm out of what appears to be out of rebuilt lumber. We know the house was looked at in the 1920s, that the beams didn't line up and they were being reused because the mortise and tenon worked with the pockets in the wrong places. So the Thomas Putnam family were like one of the preeminent families in the village. And so this clearly was kind of like a step down. And clearly must have sort of hurt the family. And then things get worse in 1690, when in a 2-week period, Anne's parents die, both of them, within 2 weeks of each other. At the time, she is 19. Her father's estate is valued at over 400 pounds, but it's fairly deeply in debt. And it takes about 5 years for her uncles to sort it out. They have to sell off more land. And again, they'll survive, but they're kind of in reduced straits. And I'm still trying to untangle the dozens of documents involved in the probate of Thomas Putnam, because it extends the last piece of property, I think, is sold off about 1705. He even borrowed money from Joseph Green. We have a list of creditors. Like one thing I do have here, this kind of interesting, is you can see this online, but the list of creditors that people that Thomas borrowed money from. And again, he was over 150 pounds, I think, in debt. It's a lot of money. But Green had only been there about a year and a half. Sure enough, he borrowed about a pound and a half from Joseph Green even. And Green, as I say, is a poor guy with not much salary, but he was willing to help out. So 1699, Anne is left to raise her 9 younger siblings. A 19-year-old, head of the family. She never marries. This clearly becomes her mission in life, is to raise her family, right? You know, we don't have a lot on her or on the family what happens, and I'm trying to tease out as much as I can by looking at surviving property transactions, court cases, things like that. But I think overall I think she did a pretty good job. There's some hints of this. One is, first off, like, only one of the kids dies before her. She loses one of her sisters when she's 12 or so, I think, 14. We're not quite sure what. But again, for that time, that's pretty good. Pretty healthy. Obviously, they've been well cared for, well fed, etc. Because otherwise, you'd have had a higher mortality rate, right? I think. We do know, though, that the family a lot moves away. Again, they're part of that Salem diaspora. Of her 4 brothers, only the oldest, Thomas III, stays in Salem Village. 2 of the sisters marry and leave Salem. The remaining 2 sisters are spinsters. So they're part of this process of leaving. And again, in this case, I think a lot of it had to do with the economic circumstances. Right? And other members of the family will leave too. As a matter of fact, her first cousin Israel Putnam, moves to Connecticut as a young man with his wife. And of course, you know him because that's General Israel Putnam, right? Battle of Bunker Hill. Is Anne's first cousin. And actually, it's his wife's a pope, and it's her, like, grandparents' chest. It's at the PBS Museum. There aren't as many nurses as there used to be in town, at least especially in these branches of the family, because there just isn't enough land for them as those generations pass out. But they seem to be doing okay. But in 1706, Anne finally decides she wants to be a church member. And again, Samuel Green works with Samuel Nurse to craft her apology, as it is called. I consider it's more sort of a confession of faith, really. But the important part for her is the statement, you know, really saying, and I mean, I won't read the whole thing, but she says, it was a great delusion, and then she stands there, or sits there, or stands with, probably with head bowed, while her minister, while Green, reads this before the congregation. And this is an important moment, because basically, you need to get up and bear all, and tell all of your sins, and beg forgiveness for anyone you've wronged. And if anybody in the parish says, yeah, or not the parish, of the church, because the church are the saints, right? Church is not a physical building, right? It's a meeting house, the building, but the church are the saints. And if any of the saints don't want you in the club, they're not convinced with your confession, you're not getting in. And again, Green had done his homework. He'd worked with Samuel Nurse. Is this okay with you? Are you going to vouch for her? And again, we don't know a lot about this, but we do know that they met and that clearly he'd approved this process. Again, some people, her confession is one of those great documents. It's a mirror. You see into what you want. If you don't like Anne and think that she was lying the whole time, you'll see. Or if you think, you know, she really was repentant, you'll see that. But, you know, what she says is, it was a great delusion of Satan that deceived me in that sad time, whereby I justly fear I've been instrumental with others, though ignorantly and unwittingly, to bring upon myself in this land the guilt of innocent blood. It was a great delusion of Satan. John Hale says very much the same thing. We lost our way in the clouds, you know. And Samuel Sewell roughly the same thing, like, you know, what happened, right? Satan deluded us. So it's, again, okay, probably about the best you're going to get. But then particularly, this is the part, I think Samuel there says, yeah, you're going to talk about my family. And in particularly, as I was a chief instrument of accusing a good wife Nurse and her 2 sisters, I desire to lie in the dust and to be humbled for it, that I was a cause with others of so sad a calamity to them and their families. Now, by the way, Anne is only not even signature literate. She signs documents, including her will, with an X. I mean, it's pretty clear that she's sitting there while Reverend Green, with Sam Nurse nodding, write this up, and they all agree that this is appropriate. And, you know, it's a very tactfully worded document, but very clear where her sentiments lie. And again, this is the adult Anne, the 25-year-old Anne, right, who's saying this. We don't know a lot about her after that. We know that if you read the 19th century accounts, like Upham, he talks about her being sickly and basically, you know, worked herself to death looking after the family. Well, we don't really have proof of that. What we do know is that, yeah, she was sickly. We know that her will was written in May 20th, 1715. And at the time, she says, I'm oftentimes sick and weak in body, but of sound mind, so I'm writing my will. But then also too, and a lot of wills say that, being of sound mind but weak body. But then she goes on and says, and I've already signed over all my land to my brother Thomas, and he's going to use that to pay my doctor's bills and my funeral expenses. So yeah, no, this is serious. We don't actually know when she died. We do know that her will is probated June 29th, 1716, so a little over a year later. So she probably dies sometime in the spring of 1716. I think I know when, because her brother Thomas's wife, Elizabeth, gives birth to a daughter on May 6th, 1716, and they call her Anna. And again, to me, and I'm thinking like, well, clearly named after her aunt. I'm actually thinking probably aunt maybe even alive, like, yeah, we don't want to confuse the two, don't worry, right? She's Anna, you're Anne. But clearly in honor of the woman who raised the family. So again, to me, that sort of shows how her family, I think, really felt about Ann Putnam. So Ann Putnam is part of the story. And also, too, she is buried at the old Putnam Cemetery on Maple Street in Danvers, right next to the state police. And there's a mound towards the front of that, which is the old Thomas Putnam tomb, which is sort of semi-collapsed, I guess. But that's where she's buried. According to Upham, she was the last person buried in that old tomb. So rest among the family. So that's one of the stories that I'm telling. And it's interesting too, is what's intriguing to me is like actually Joseph Green had died before her. He died like the previous November 1715. And again, a fellow who was, they said at the time, was exceedingly lamented. By the way, he's buried in Wadsworth Cemetery, not far from Elizabeth Parris, right? Reverend Parris's first wife. And it's interesting because there were like all sorts of things, sermons published. Increase Mather writes the preface to the sermon that's published about him. It says, although the people there were too much divided before his being amongst them, yet in his days and under his ministry there was peace and truth. And there's actually this long flowing elegy written about him by none other than Nicholas Noyes, who was one of the people in the Salem witch trials that I really don't have a lot of respect for. So he clearly was a huge fan of Green and wrote an elegy about him. And apparently, Noyes was a fairly famous elegist for his time. So he was, again, two really wonderful people in Ann Putnam and Joseph Green who really helped heal their community. But I will say this, they were not perfect, right? And again, we know Ann's transgressions as a youth. Green, 1707 in his diary, early 1708. This is really tough. We lost our serving girl, and boy, it's hard getting things done around here. Within a few months, he's bought an enslaved African girl, Flora. And when he dies, he wills her to his wife, wills Flora to his wife, as long as she stays unmarried. So again, it's a very different time, and a lot of these ministers, Cotton Mather, also too, and many of these people did. Samuel Sewall, the one who did it. Samuel Sewall, of course, in 1700 writes The Selling of Joseph, the first anti-slavery tract in what's now the United States. So anyhow, that's one story that I wanted to mention, and I'll mention two others. I'll say one thing is, because I almost never get a chance to talk about this, but in Storm of Witchcraft, I really loved studying and working on healing marriages. That is, those marriages that took place amongst the victims' families, victims and accusers, over the next 50 or 100 years, really trying to heal those wounds, right? And I'm exploring more of those. I'm particularly I'm focusing a lot on the nurses and the Putnams again, because that seemed to be like a good place to start. But I will tell you quickly my favorite story from Storm of Witchcraft about this, and that's about the Barkers. So, three brothers, Jonathan, Benjamin, and Jesse Barker, are amongst the first three settlers of what is now Sunday River, Maine. that held on to that real estate, just think. On a mile down slope from the ski area. Anyhow, the brothers, though, had been born in Methuen. And the family was originally from nearby Andover. And yes, their great-grandfather is William Barker, who made the exorbitant confession of witchcraft in 1692, where he accused literally everybody and his brother pretty much of witches. And amongst those people he accused was Abigail Faulkner. So, fast forward back to 1788, and one of the brothers, Jonathan, wants to marry Nancy Swan. Now, Nancy's father, James, had moved the family to Bethel, right next to Sunday River, in 1780, also from Methuen. So the families probably knew each other. The kids probably grew up together. And the Barkers, like the Swans, had first been an Andover family. And in fact, Nancy's great-great-uncle was Timothy Swan, kind of the notorious Timothy Swan, who supposedly died of affliction by witchcraft. He actually dies on February 2nd, 1693. You can see his gravestone in the North Cemetery in what's now North Andover, right, the old burying ground. Actually, his afflictions were blamed on 16 different people as witches, including, yes, Abigail Faulkner. So you have a Swan and a Barker getting married. Okay. Where do they get married? They travel over 180 miles to get married in Massachusetts. They do this when Nancy's 4 months pregnant. By the way, there was a lot of premarital sex in 17th and 18th century Massachusetts. And in some cases, basically, I'm sure Nancy's father was like, yeah, you guys can get married, but until you have to, you're working the farm. Because you're a good laborer, right? And this is, again, not the most Puritan of folk, necessarily, right? You can see where, you may understand one reason why they moved north. But think about this. Under those conditions, your bride-to-be is 4 months pregnant, and you're in Sunday River. You are walking, canoeing, taking a ship a long time to get from there back home to Massachusetts, and then go up the Merrimack River. And you don't even stop in Methuen, where you'd expect, or Andover, where you'd expect the wedding might take place, right? Oh no. You go 40 miles further inland to Acton. Why are you doing this? You don't have any family members that I've been able to find on either side in Acton, right? Well, it's a healing marriage, just to heal an old wound. They are married by the local justice of the peace in Acton, whose house is still owned by the Historical Society here, Colonel Francis Faulkner. He is the son of Ami Ruhama Faulkner. Ami Ruhama is Hebrew for my Lord has shown great mercy, and the mercy in this case was the fact of sparing Ami Ruhama's mother's life, because this is the baby that Abigail Faulkner is pregnant with when she pleads her belly, and it saves her life in 1692. So there's a direct connection between Francis Faulkner, named after his grandfather, Abigail's husband, right, and this baby, and connects the families, right? The testimony of Abigail's sister, actually, Elizabeth Johnson Sr., actually accused Barker. She said, she was carried thither upon a pole, and her sister Faulkner was there, and William Barker and others she knew not. So you have this coming together, very symbolically. This family has clearly gone out of their way as an opportunity to heal an old wound with the Faulkner family of Acton, now, not of Andover anymore, but they still clearly were in touch with these people. It still mattered. And I'll tell you how much it mattered. About a dozen years later, Jonathan and Nancy's nephew, another Barker boy, marries a Faulkner girl. And again, it's the same sort of deal where they're up in Maine and they travel back to Massachusetts to get married. So my point, here we are, and that was like 18, this is what, 120 years after the witch trials. People remembered this stuff, right? Which gets me to the, you keep that in mind, we'll come back to that. So next thing I want to turn to, the important part of the book, is this issue of like, how do people, okay, people are doing lots of things to try to heal. For some people, let's get out of town. For others, let's celebrate a healing marriage, a family's coming together. For some, it's like, let's have collective amnesia and forget where these things took place, even though we know where they took place. And I'm not going to talk about that today, but that's what's going on with Proctor's life, where every 20 years, someone around a newspaper will say, hey, we know where the excuse is. Crickets. As I say, we didn't find anything. We confirmed the execution site, and our job was to make sure that it was never forgotten. And thank God the mayor of the city rose to the occasion and put this memorial site there. Anyhow, so how do you, but the other issue is like, how do you prevent witch hunts? Well, good start. There are lots of ways to do this, right? But one would be to provide people with legal rights to protect them against future witch hunts. And there's a big problem here that they have to deal with, and that is, in 1692, it was illegal in both England and her colonies for lawyers to practice for fees, that is, to have a defense counsel. And this is a problem that's recognized in the 18th century, but I'm pretty sure they recognized this immediately. Normally, people would say it doesn't really matter. The judge is there to ferret out the truth and give a balanced opinion. And in fact, if people wanted legal advice, they were supposed to go to the local justice of the peace, and, or the judge, and say, hey, what do I do about this? Clearly, we all know that in 1692, justice was miscarried, right? And there was in a big time where the judges come in sort of saying, like, like to Sarah Good, like those first questions, like basically, why do you afflict these children? How long have you been in league with Satan? And by the way, when did you stop beating your husband, right? I mean, there's clearly these are hanging judges already. So that means they're not going to be impartial and try to balance things out. So in this case, really, if they had someone on their side cross-examining witnesses, would have made a big difference. But they weren't even allowed to. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, because in England, only in 1696 do they allow defense counsel for the first time, and it's only for treason. It actually has a lot to do with the Glorious Revolution and Tories versus Whigs, because the Tories were in power and they were using the Treason Act to get their Whigs friends locked up. But beyond this, in England, this is amazing. It is not legal to hire defense counsel in criminal cases, fully legal, until the Prisoners' Counsel Act of 1836, one of the great reform acts of the 1830s in England, right? But think about this. Look at how Massachusetts dealt differently with this. So first off, in Massachusetts, as early as 1641 in the Body of Liberties, there's an implied right there for advice and counsel. Different than paid lawyers. People were always, okay, my father, grandfather, great-grandfather were all lawyers, so I can tell lawyer jokes. Lawyers have always thought people have always thought that lawyers charged too much and were a little slick, maybe, right? So it's like, do we really want to let these people practice or not? It was kind of, But there certainly was, you were allowed to have advice and counsel and trials under the Bodies of Liberties. Unfortunately, under the new charter of 1691, that and all other Massachusetts laws go away. And you're back under English common law. So there is no advice or of counsel of any kind in 1692 in the witch trials. Really interesting though. In the summer of 1692 and fall, amid the witch trials, while Massachusetts Governor Phipps and the General Court is busy writing new legislative acts, including the witch trials judges, right? They passed a Judiciary Act, which is this long act, and I'm still trying to explore exactly what went wrong with this, but it's a long act setting up the courts, what we now call the Supreme Court, and all the local, the district courts essentially in the colony. But that law is disallowed by the Privy Council in England in 1695. There's some things they feel there that are repugnant to the laws of England, and I'm trying to find out what it was exactly they didn't like. But again, so 1692, we need something here. People are, being taken advantage of here. So when the act is disallowed in 1695, 1697, Massachusetts passes another act to allow counsel and especially lawyers to practice for fees. Privy Council disallows that in 1698. Finally, in 1701, they pass another Judiciary Act here. Can you tell that this was kind of important to people in Massachusetts, right? I mean, again, England has just passed this act in 1698 for treason with nothing else, and here's like, no, everybody deserves legal counsel if they want it. Finally, that 1701 Act allows lawyers to practice in Massachusetts for fees. And so again, to me, it's fascinating to me. I think this is the first time in the West English-speaking world, aside from that for treason in England, that this was allowed. And again, to me, that's a direct reflection of the witch trials and how things had gone wrong, where they really tried to take steps to fix it. And again, I'm still piecing this together, and frankly, I'm kind of amazed that no one's really sort of looked into this before. Lawyers are practicing, and it's clear that people remembered the injustice. And it's also true that people keep on remembering the injustice, and I've talked about this in Storm of Witchcraft, again, these petitions before the General Court as late as 1794 for restoration of innocency. One of the young legislators who hears that in the 1740s is a fellow who will be the future Governor Thomas Hutchinson. He's a politician, he's also a historian. If you read Hutchinson's History of Massachusetts Bay, Volume 2, which is published in 1767, the first 39 pages of that volume are dedicated to a discussion and a description of the Salem witch trials. And what does he say in particular in this? He says, these people didn't have counsel, there was no one to cross-examine the witnesses, so no wonder they got a raw deal. Okay. Well, you know, Hutchinson's book was a bestseller. Thomas Jefferson owned a copy of it in his library, for example. This wasn't just a Massachusetts bestseller. John Adams and other people were acutely aware of this stuff. In fact, even before that volume came out in 1766, John and Abigail are in Salem and they visit. He writes in his diary about visiting the execution site at Witchcraft Hill, what he called Witchcraft Hill. John and Abigail are in town visiting her sister Mary and her husband, another lawyer, John Cranch. And they make two trips in 1766 to Salem. We're not quite sure which one it was on, but it was on one of those trips that the famous pastel portraits of young John and Abigail were painted by Benjamin Blythe, who's a Salem artist. Which leads me to my since in honor of Bridget Bishop. Interesting fact, right? And again, talking about people knowing these things. One wonders what the conversation was like between John Adams and Benjamin Blythe. People imagine like, well, I was up on Witchcraft Hill last night, and which, you know, and again, I don't have this record, but I'm sure Blythe was very much aware and may have said, well, you know, my great-grandfather, the name was a little different back then. We called him John Bly, B-L-Y-E or B-L-Y. Of course, he testified against Bridget Bishop. He's the one who testifies about the pockets in her cellar, in the pockets of the stone wall in her basement, and he's doing some construction, and he and her son, and they find the pockets. So in fact, you know, again, like all of these people are connected to witchcraft. And again, do I have a document where John Blythe talks about this? No, but again, do you folks know about, you know, what your grandparents and great-grandparents did and the most famous events in their life and what happened to them? Yeah, probably do. Especially something like that, right? And in fact, John, it keeps on showing up things like in his diaries, and this, he writes this letter to Abigail in 1774 from York, Maine, where he's on the circuit, and he's talking about being at the table with Deacon Sayward. Jonathan Sayward is a loyalist, the notorious loyalist and the richest guy in Salem, and he basically says, you know what, I agree. He says, Sayward says, there's only one point which he differed in the opinion from Governor Hutchinson. And it was in regard, you're thinking like, okay, we're talking politics here, right? He says, it's in the regard to the reality of witches, a reality of witchcraft and the existence of witches. This is what lunch or dinner table conversation is like amongst like lawyers and the gentry in Massachusetts in 1774. Less than a year before the revolution starts here, right? So again, these people knew this. And again, they were reminded by Hutchinson's book, but they knew this. And think about this. 1692, well, you go ahead to 1774, that's only 82 years, right? There were still people living, and again, let's put it this way. Last year, this weekend, we celebrated D-Day anniversary, 80th anniversary of D-Day. Now again, I don't think any of us were there. I don't think any of us remember it. We all know about it, right? We have family members, friends, neighbors who were there, who remember the news, etc., etc. I still get a chill when I remember my mom telling me about how she heard about Pearl Harbor, right? You know, just out on a country drive, and then all of a sudden they hear on the radio. Wow. So you know, again, people in 1774 were not that far removed from 1692. They knew what was going on. Look at those healing marriages, right? It was very much a topic of conversation. So in that regard too, the one other thing I think that people knew was the need to protect people's rights. So I want to talk a bit about Elbridge Gerry. Of course, he's best known for the gerrymander, that evil beast. But he really is a forgotten founder, right? I mean, he signed the Declaration of Independence. He signed the Articles of Confederation. He attended the Constitutional Convention. He was the 8th governor of Massachusetts. He was the 5th vice president of the United States. Not bad. He actually dies in office. He's the only one, I think, who signed the Declaration who's buried in Washington, because he died in D.C. as Madison's vice president. So, guy you don't hear as much about as you probably should. He attends the Constitutional Convention in 1787, and he is one of the most active speakers. He realizes we need a strong government. He says, basically, if we don't have one, we're going to be gobbled up by our enemies. But he's really worried about people's rights. He's going like, they're not being spelled out in this document. We're giving the federal government a huge amount of power. Where are the people's rights? And all the other guys are like, yeah, don't worry, Elbridge, it's implied. Now we see how well that works, right? Implied rights. Gerry wouldn't take that. He was one of only 3, again, I think this tore him apart, because he knew the problem if we didn't have a strong government, but he refused to sign on. He was one of only 3 people who attended the convention who didn't sign on to basically in favor of ratifying the Constitution. Fast forward ahead to January 1788, and the ratification process is underway. Now, technically, you only need 2/3 of the 13 states to ratify, but you really need unanimity, particularly Massachusetts, because Massachusetts is one of the biggest, most important states, the hub of the universe, as we all know. And what happens if you have a place like Massachusetts, even if you get all the other states to agree, if Massachusetts, yeah, no, we're out, what's going to happen? First 5 states ratify without any serious opposition, right? Almost like representative. Yep, sounds good, let's do it. Massachusetts, not so much. Remember, this is the place where Shays' Rebellion took place. We're a little more doubting, particularly folks out in central and western Massachusetts, Worcester County, where I come from. So there's serious opposition here to passing the Constitution, and it's really like a coin flip as to whether this is going to pass or not. And guess who's leading the opposition? The eloquent founding father, Elbridge Gerry, who argues repeatedly against the Constitution. And finally, he agrees to go along with it. He realizes again that we need it. We need a strong central government, or we will be eaten by our enemies one by one. However, he says, okay, one deal. I will sign on and I will use my leadership to get the votes we need. When that first Congress meets in 1789, the first thing we do is we pass this thing called the Bill of Rights. To make sure that happened, Gerry was elected to that first Congress, and yes, they did. There were actually, original drafts were about 12 amendments. There's a couple that have to do with like voting rights that are kind of never passed, which weren't really central. But look at what they did pass, right? The First Amendment, those sacred rights. The Fifth Amendment, right to grand jury, no double jeopardy, no self-incrimination, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Oh my God, really? I mean, think about this, right? Sixth Amendment, a compulsory process for obtaining witnesses in his favor and to have the assistance of counsel for his defense. It's in the Constitution, right? You go, okay, well, but Elbridge Gerry, well, so what's the big deal? Well, hopefully you all know that the gerrymander was actually made of Essex County, right? And that Marblehead, the claws of the gerrymander beast, Salem is one claw, Marblehead's the other. Elbridge Gerry, born, raised, lived, did not die, lived most of his life where? Marblehead. You know, and I got to try to find out exactly where he lived, because I wonder kind of, could you see Gallows Hill from there? So again, to me, I'm now searching through all of Elbridge Gerry's papers and everything he ever said or wrote down, and to see if I can find, so it's kind of like the smoking gun. Can I prove to you right now that he said, we need rights because of the Salem witches? But again, look at the way people were thinking. Look at the way John Adams and others were thinking. John Adams who defends, he says, basically, John, why did you defend those British scum who killed the people in the Boston Massacre? Remember, it was a massacre. And he basically says, what's his quote on this? He said it would be, let me find the exact quote. He said, it would be basically as foul, I don't have the exact here. Basically said, it would be as foul a stain on us as the witch executions in Salem.
Wow.
That's why I defended them. They deserve justice. Yeah. So, yeah. So again, to me, I think that sort of shows how people tried to deal in some ways with the legacy of the Salem witch trials. And again, that sort of process of healing, that long process, and hoping that would never happen again. So that's all I got for today for you folks. Sorry for and I'd be happy to answer any questions, but I may not have the answers because this is still a work in progress. But, yeah.
What year did Samuel Sewell became Chief Justice of the Superior Court?
Yeah, I think it was was it 17? Maybe was it the early teens? Right? It was. I think maybe around 17, 10, 11. I'm guessing.
Okay.
But that kind of ballpark, I think.
Makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Why do you ask? Just.
I don't know. It just came to
Yeah,
mind.
that's good. That's a good. Yeah.
When
Okay, so there's an avenue I need to pursue. You're right. Right.
Considering, of
Yeah.
course, he was the only judge who made
Yeah.
a formal apology for his involvement.
Or even
in
informal.
trials.
As far as we know.
I
Right.
was actually speaking to a couple of tourists today at the Salem Witch Trials Memorial at the old burying point. How my assumption from when I was a teenager, Hathor, is that he firmly believed that those he sentenced to death had no right to live.
I mean, I think I don't know about Hathor. I tend to think you're right.
Yeah.
I certainly, I absolutely believe that Stoughton went to his death thinking that there were witches out there that should have been executed. I have no doubt about that whatsoever. He showed no remorse. And Sewell, on the other hand, as I say, is I think was an amazing fellow who really, I think, dedicated most of the rest of his life, one way or another, to trying to help those families, to get reversals of attainder, to get restitution. And when he dies, it's clear that he leaves that task to his sons, right? One who's the minister of South Church, and one who's a major in the militia and in the legislature. And the sons are both eminently involved in the later efforts here to try to drum up support in Salem and other places. That's something done about it. So yeah, but and of course, Gedney dies young. We don't know a lot. There's not a lot from the judges after that, right? But clearly, right. The only, aside from and the only pardons apologies we have are Ann Putnam's and Sewell's, and then those 12 members of the jury. Now, there actually were probably about 50 or 60 jurymen at least, but and we don't have any hint that any others do. There's someone was it? I think it was. Upham talks about like Nicholas. He thinks Nicholas Noyes might have, but there's no evidence that I've seen to back that up.
Right.
Yeah. Other questions? Well, thank you very much.